Okay, so let's dive right in. We're going to be looking at three ancient prophets, Jonah, Micah, and Nahum. But here's the thing. Instead of thinking about them as these separate, kind of dusty figures from history, we're going to see them as three parts of one single, really powerful story. It's a story about how divine purpose doesn't just happen in some perfect, abstract way. No, it unfolds right here in the middle of our messy, complicated world.
You know, it's worth asking why the Bible is so full of stories. And this quote just nails it. Instead of a dry rulebook, it's packed with narratives. And there's a genius reason for that. See, stories don't just talk at you. They pull you in. They kind of tease you, draw you along, and before you even realize it, you're not just watching from the sidelines anymore. You're a participant. You're right there in the middle of the action.
And that's where this whole thing gets incredibly personal. We find ourselves in these epic narratives, but what happens when the hero of the story, the person God chooses for this big mission, is, well, not very heroic? What if they're clumsy or reluctant or, let's be honest, kind of a mess? Well, that's exactly where our story begins. So, let's start with our first character portrait, the one and only, the famously reluctant prophet, Jonah. Now, everybody knows this story of Jonah and the giant fish, but if you look closer, there's this element of what the source material calls slapstick clumsiness about him. He is constantly just bumbling his way through his divine assignment. I mean, think about it for a second. We expect a prophet, a messenger from God, to be courageous, right? Ideal, maybe even perfect. But the hero we actually get in this story, he's the total opposite. He's clumsy, he's inept, he literally runs away from the job he's given. He is the last person you would pick for something this important. But here's the brilliant twist. His imperfection isn't some mistake in the story, it's the main feature. As we're kind of chuckling at Jonah's ridiculous attempts to dodge God, our own defenses start to come down, and suddenly we see a little bit of ourselves in his struggle. We realize that God isn't necessarily looking for perfect people. And this is what makes him feel like a companion, not a superhero. I mean, he tries to run from God, and it goes horribly wrong. He finally preaches the right message, but he does it with the worst attitude, even getting mad when God shows mercy. And yet, the entire time, God is working through his flaws, not just tolerating them. Jonah is proof that our screw-ups don't disqualify us. Okay, so let's move to our next prophet and see how this idea builds. If God uses flawed people like Jonah, then what's the tool he gives them? Well, the answer is words. And this is where Micah comes in, to show us that words have the power to literally remake a world. First off, we've got to totally redefine what we think a prophet is. It's not a fortune teller, someone who just predicts the stock market. No. A prophet is a master of language, a master of metaphor. When they look around and see a world in ruins, just full of moral rubble, they take up the work of words, using this God-energized language to rebuild everything that's been broken. So how does this rebuilding actually happen? It's a pretty amazing process. First, you have to start by looking unflinchingly at the mess, the moral rubble of a society. From there, the prophet learns a new way to speak, a language that's grounded in God's truth. And this new language, it has real power. It can both call out what's wrong and completely renew the community from the inside out. And this is where the real magic is. These are not mere words. This kind of prophetic language, especially metaphor, doesn't just describe things on the surface. It actually plunges us into a world of presence. It makes these huge, intangible concepts like love and justice and God's own faithfulness feel absolutely real and here and now. Words literally create the world we inhabit. Okay, so we've got a flawed messenger armed with world-building words. But what good are those words if no one can actually hear them over all the noise of the world? This brings us to our third prophet, Nahum, and his really important lesson on where we should focus our attention. I mean, the stage of history is always dominated by these larger-than-life figures, right? Swaggering superpowers, bullying leaders, massive armies. They make so much noise, they're all over the news, they demand our attention, and they make us think they're the only game in town. But then you get a quote like this one from the poet George Meredith, and it just flips everything on its head. The true world-changing forces are often the ones we don't even notice. They're quiet, they're concealed, they're so easy to miss. The source material reminds us that God's way of working is often in this quietness. If we're only listening for the shouting, we're going to miss him completely. So Nahum's assignment was basically to go after the loudest noise of his time, the absolutely terrifying Assyrian Empire. But his goal wasn't just to preach hate. His real purpose was to use words to dismantle their illusion of permanent power, to make their downfall imaginable. This was an act of liberation. It was meant to free people from the paralysis of fear and distraction, to clear the stage so they could finally refocus on God's quiet, central work.
All right, let's pull all these threads together. Jonah, Micah, Nahum. 3 different prophets, but as we've seen, they're really telling one single cohesive story about how God acts in the world and, more importantly, how he invites us to be a part of it. When you lay it all out like this, it just clicks, doesn't it? You can see this single, beautiful narrative unfolding. It starts with Jonah, who acknowledges our very human condition. We're flawed, we're inept, and we tend to run away. But the divine action? God works through our flaws anyway. Then comes Micah, who looks at the broken world we live in. The divine action there? God gives us his words, which have the power to rebuild reality itself. And finally, Nahum tackles our tendency to get distracted by all the noise and power, reminding us that God's true work is quiet, and it requires our focused attention. So, you see, this ancient 3-part story, it's not really just about them. It brings us right back to us, here and now. It sets up a really powerful question for our own lives.
So let's really bring this home. If it is true that God works through our very real, very human flaws, and if our words can actually carry the power to rebuild what's broken, and if the most important work in the world is happening quietly away from the spotlight, well then what does that mean for you? What quiet, seemingly small, but truly world-changing story are you being invited to join? Now that is something to think about.